let's move into the second half of the tapestry that depicts the conquest of England. And this tapestry has provided evidence for many historians about medieval warfare and military strategies. Do you think it's valid evidence? Have you used it yourself to think about military strategies in the Middle Ages?
I think, yes, I have, and I think it's actually, there are many, many interesting aspects of medieval warfare and of ways to prepare for a battle that are depicted in this. One of the things that's in some ways kind of fun about the tapestry is that it doesn't just present the military aspects, but it also presents the kind of logistics of warfare. So it presents, it has images of arms being carried, of the ships being built, the ships that were involved in the invasion, of the horses that were involved in the battle, of some of the military strategy. There's actually a very interesting scene where William has landed and is trying to kind of bring about a battle, which is a very common problem with in medieval warfare, that armies don't want to stay don't want to stay in the field for very long, any longer than they have to, because it's difficult for them to find provisions. It's difficult for the leaders to keep order and discipline among their troops. So what they really want is they want quick resolution. They want the battles to come quickly. And there's a very interesting scene, where the Normans are burning somebody's house. A woman and a child are presented as coming out of a house that's been set on fire, because this was the standard strategy, was to harry the countryside and to make it appear as if though the legitimate king was incapable of defending the country, and so the invading army is able to bring pressure on the king by doing these kinds of atrocities of war, and that precipitates a battle. And in fact, that does seem to be what happened in this case. Whether or not it was related to the harrying is uncertain. But so it shows a lot of these strategies. It shows building fortifications. It shows the ways that armies engaged each other. It's an interesting example of different weaponry that was in use. So the importance of archers, for example, is very well illustrated in the tapestry, and probably was one of the decisive features of the actual battle, was the success of the archers. So there are many different features of warfare that are depicted in the tapestry.
And there's a succession of the shield walls that are erected at each stage, and it's interesting because they're depicted in two dimensions. And is that a strategy that was common, the wall of shields that were erected to prevent the enemy from entering into the row of cavalry?
Well, it's not clear. I mean, the shields may have been. The shields are valuable because most of the weaponry that's used is projectile weaponry, right? So the knights. I mean, it's a transitional phase. The later 11th and 12th century are really a transitional phase in terms of warfare. What we tend to think of as the kind of traditional, classic medieval battle that involves knights on horseback mounting a cavalry charge is probably not quite developed at this point. So the horses are probably more, because of the mobility that they provide in battle, because it's generally easier to fight from on high than it is from on the ground. You can move more quickly when you need to move quickly. But it's unlikely that what the Normans did at the Battle of Hastings was actually to mount a full-scale cavalry charge. What they appeared to have done, and what the tapestry depicts quite well, is that they had archers that were shooting a lot of arrows into the English ranks, and they had spears or javelins that were thrown from horseback, and these seem to be the two main weapons. The strategy of the English was, first of all, they were the tapestry depicts them almost entirely on foot. So they were not using horses at Hastings. There's been a long-standing debate among historians about whether or not that was a long-standing feature of Anglo-Saxon warfare. That is, that horse warfare was not known or not commonly used by the Anglo-Saxons. So it was an innovation of the Normans, and it was the strategic military advantage that allowed them to win the Battle of Hastings. Or if just the circumstances at the time, the circumstances that led up to battle, where Harold was not really fully prepared to engage William, but felt that he had to. He wasn't fully prepared because he had just fought a battle against an invading Norwegian king shortly before the Battle of Hastings. So he wasn't able to assemble his full army. And it may be that the Anglo-Saxons were familiar, had actually used horses in battle, but they didn't have them at this particular point in time. So the strategy was to build as tight and as compact and as strong a wall as possible to deflect the projectiles that were coming in and to stop the advance of the horses as they came. By most accounts of the battle, Harold had set up on an elevation, and so Harold had the advantage of higher ground. And so the tactic of putting together your shields and making a kind of solid wall makes sense in that situation when you have the high ground.
Yeah, and visually it makes sense within the narrative. But one of the most dramatic events is Harold's death. And it's also debated because apparently the arrow that blinds him was a later restoration. And so there's a significant amount of debate as to whether Harold appears twice. Mm-hmm. And that event is at the end of the Tapestry. In terms of an argument about a pro-Norman version, does that event strike you as fitting in with the Norman position and interpretation of events?
I think it does. I mean, one of the issues is it's not clear that the tapestry as we have it is a complete tapestry, and it's possible that there were additional scenes. In fact, it's quite likely that there were additional scenes at the end of it. And there's one scene in particular that seems to be missing, and that is the scene of William being crowned. If such a scene was part of it, it would really make a nice bookend because of the presentation of King Edward at the beginning of the tapestry, sitting in majesty as the crowned King of England, and then the narrative is the sequence of events that lead up to the crowning of William. But it was in some ways the death of Harold is a culmination because much of the story is about the interaction between William and Harold, and the oath that Harold took to William, the relationship between them while they were in Normandy, then the usurpation by from the Norman perspective of the throne, and then the response to that, which is the whole second half sequence of the battle scenes, and then the kind of resolution of that in Harold's death. The other thing, Harold's brothers were also killed at the battle. So this was a tragedy, not just for Harold, but for the entire Godwin family, which was essentially wiped out as a result of this battle.
Okay, let's turn to some of the actual images of combat in the last third of the tapestry, and it seems that beginning with the first shield wall, the level of violence heightens until the dramatic ending of Harold's death. How does this type of violence we see particularly in the margins, the figures being maimed, they're decapitated, their armor being taken off, so naked bodies towards the end. How does this level of violence compare to other evidence we have for medieval warfare?
Well, I would say that warfare was
was an extremely common experience in the Middle Ages. It was common because political position and wealth was intimately bound up with success in warfare. The fact that William became king as a result of this battle shows how much is invested in warfare. So, you know, it's a common experience for probably for most people in society, and even the people who aren't directly involved in the fighting are caught up in it because, you know, we talked a while back about the strategies to bring somebody to battle. So you burn the villages, you feed off the land while you're traveling. So common people even would have had a lot of experience, a lot of familiarity with what was going on in military terms. A battle like this, you know, probably people came out to look at the battlefield after it was over. So they would have seen the bodies laying around. The kind of stripping of bodies that you see in the margins here was a common feature of medieval battles. You know, it was like a small industry of stripping bodies at the end because anything that was valuable was worth taking from the body. So this is one feature of it, is that it shows something that people had a lot of experience with and a lot of familiarity with, I would say.
Well, let's talk about the people who might have actually been looking at the tapestry. And as you know, the earliest evidence we have for its display dates from the 15th century when it was displayed in the Cathedral of Bayeux. But most people have argued that it was intended for a banquet or audience hall. And if that is the case, who would have been looking at the tapestry and in what circumstances?
Well, I suppose, I mean, it would have, just given the length of the tapestry, you have to assume that it was a fairly big space that it would be displayed in. And so, you know, the initial audience must have been people of fairly elevated social status. They must have been primarily the levels of society that would have engaged in warfare like this, and for whom military ardor and military success was tantamount to their position in society. So in that sense, I think that they would be seeing confirmation of their position and of their role, and an illustration of what their life, you know, a justification in some ways for their position in their lives. It's a tale of victory. So if the audience is primarily the ruling class of England after the conquest, it's also a kind of reminder of their justification for being the ruling class. And there was a tradition for several hundred years of looking back to the conquest and tracing ancestry back to the conquest as a way of justifying elevated social position in England. So I think that would have been a very prominent function for this, would be to emphasize the kind of the glorious history of the conquering people. It's possible that there was a broader audience. It's possible that there was some kind of broader public showing that would have been use that would have been made of this, where people would have been people at a lesser social level would have been reminded of this great event, and if it serves to justify the Norman rule in England, that this is a way of reminding people that this is the whole story. This is the sequence of events that led to the current situation. It's difficult because we actually don't know that much about how it was used, or we don't really have other examples of similar kinds of objects from the period that you can readily point to and say, well, this is exactly like this other object, and we do know how this other object was used.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about how the tapestry presents events from a pro-Norman perspective, but also about the ambiguity in the tapestry. And I'm wondering about the message that it conveys about war and how this audience would have perceived the tapestry. Do you think that it's a series of pictures that promotes and glorifies war, or are there ways in which it might serve as a warning about how brutal and violent war actually is?
I think it does a little bit of both. I mean, the first reading of it, I would say, is that it emphasizes the success of the Normans, which is based on their military conquest, and so the kind of underlying theme of it is that that warfare is necessary, that warfare can have good outcomes. If you consider that the success of Duke William is a good outcome, that warfare was necessary for that outcome. There also was a very widely held belief in the Middle Ages that the person who won a battle was chosen by God, had God on his side. And in William's case, this was particularly important, or particularly evident, because he also had papal backing for the enterprise, for the invasion of England. So there's a kind of mingling of religion and politics and warfare. So there's that in that sense there's a positive portrayal. But at the same time, I think what's interesting is that it's also possible to see some episodes and some ways in which the designer of the tapestry was trying to draw attention to the fact that warfare also has negative repercussions, negative implications. We mentioned a while ago the scene where a house is being burned, and what appears to be a woman and a child is fleeing from the house. So this is not a necessary scene. I mean, there really wasn't. It doesn't add that much to the narrative story. It does show, war has this cost, and it has this cost for civilians who aren't directly involved in the fighting. And then the fact that the bodies are shown that in the margins and decapitated bodies, and the artist actually, the designer spends quite a bit of time showing different ways that bodies can be mutilated. So there are bodies that have spears through them, there are bodies that are pierced with arrows, there are bodies that have had their heads hacked off, their limbs hacked off. Again, none of these things is a necessary accompaniment of this, and it does make you wonder if there's an underlying tone that, while the warfare is necessary and the warfare is the precursor of political success, it's also something that comes with a considerable cost.
That certainly seems to have been lost in the way that the tapestry was used in later historical episodes. And I'm thinking of Napoleon Bonaparte's interest in the tapestry, and then the Nazis' interest in the tapestry. Can you talk a little bit about parallels with those historical events?
I would say, first of all, that kind of the subtlety, I guess, is what we're saying, is that if there's a subtle message of pointing out the costs of war, that often can be lost. That people can take the first impression of what the tapestry is saying or doing, and run with that. I think throughout history, the obvious and immediate interpretation is that this is a triumphal tale of a successful conquest, and so it appeals to other conquerors in subsequent periods of history who see themselves as embodiments of the great conqueror, and the great conqueror who's justified in the conquest that they want to undertake. So Napoleon is interested in the Bayeux Tapestry. Hitler is interested in the Bayeux Tapestry. I think to some extent they saw themselves as worthy successors of a great and well-known, famous king like King William.
I guess that's a lesson for us to look closely at our evidence.
Absolutely.
And also look for the other story.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
We have to recognize, too, that this is a story that's told by the victors, and one assumes that Odo of Bayeux, William's brother, commissioned the tapestry. And do you agree with that? Is there are points, we've talked about the ambiguity, but it does seem to be a story that is from the victor's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that I think it is very much, and one of the unfortunate things, the other historical evidence that survives, so mainly the chronicles that survive, And there is actually, by the standards of the 11th century, there is a very substantial amount of documentary chronicle evidence that discusses what happened, the relationship between England, Normandy, and Scandinavia, this particular the battle itself. But the vast majority of it is Norman evidence, and it too is told from the perspective of the victors. And so there seems to be a kind of consistency of narrative that emerges, but it's a consistency that's always told from that perspective. And it would be great to have a more contemporary Anglo-Saxon evidence to show, because the story can be told in a much different way. I mean, the story could be told, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, that Edward had a change of heart, that he actually designated Harold as a successor, that he was accepted by the English, that he was duly consecrated as the king, and that he was doing his best as king to protect his kingdom, and that William is the usurper in that narrative, and that would be an equally valid telling of it. But that's not the telling that we get in the Bayeux Tapestry. Odo does appear very prominently in the tapestry, probably more prominently than he deserves to if you're looking at simply his importance in the events of 1066. There's one scene in particular where he appears to be the one who rallies the Norman troops when they fall away at one point. And some historians have suggested that it may very well be true that as a bishop he was not, he had no issue, no problem with engaging in battle. It was not a common thing for an 11th century bishop, but it was not a completely unheard of thing. In fact, some people have even suggested that he's a prototype for the bishop in the Song of Roland, who was also equally kind of engaged in military activity.
That's great. I think we're going to end there. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.